Margaret Watson set her alarm for 5 o'clock every morning, long before the sun rose over the Chicago skyline. As the head nurse in a children's ward, her day began earlier than most people's, but Margaret had grown used to the rhythm. The quiet hours before dawn were her sanctuary, a brief moment when the world seemed to pause, when she could gather her strength for the challenges ahead. The faint buzz of her alarm filled the room, and with a practiced motion, she silenced it. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling of her modest apartment. Then, with a sigh, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Coffee was her ritual. She brewed it strong, filling the small kitchen with a rich aroma that reminded her of her father's Sunday mornings years ago, before family tensions had hardened into something more complicated. She changed into her crisp white uniform, pinned her name tag in place, and carried her mug toward the window. The city stretched before her, steel and glass catching the faintest traces of dawn. 2 years ago, she had bought this apartment. It wasn't large, but it was hers, a space carefully arranged, where every wall carried pieces of her heart. The walls were decorated with handmade gifts from her patients, drawings of sunflowers and rainbows, paper cranes, and a collage of photographs. Among them was one picture Margaret could never ignore. It was a snapshot of her and Sarah Jenkins, taken during a hospital art day. Margaret's arm was wrapped protectively around the girl's frail shoulders, and both were smiling, genuine, bright smiles that spoke of resilience and trust. Sarah. At just 10 years old, Sarah had already endured more than most people could bear. After losing her parents in a tragic car accident, she had been passed from one distant relative to another. Then came the leukemia diagnosis, which brought her into Margaret's ward. Margaret had been her nurse, but more than that, she had been her anchor. She remembered the day Sarah's hair began to fall out. The girl had cried bitterly, clutching the strands in her small hands. That night, Margaret went home, took a pair of scissors, and cut her own hair short. "Now we match," she had told Sarah the next morning. The memory still made Margaret's throat tighten. Against all odds, Sarah's leukemia had gone into remission, and she had been placed with a foster family, but their bond never faded. Sarah often visited Margaret, calling her Aunt Maggie, with affection that pierced Margaret's heart in a way she hadn't expected. Recently, the thought had grown stronger. I want to protect this child. I want to give her a real home. For a single woman with no children, the idea of adoption was daunting, but the conviction only deepened with time. The sudden vibration of her phone pulled her from her thoughts. The screen flashed a familiar name, Mother. Margaret hesitated, her finger hovering before she finally pressed answer. "Maggie, how are you? Are you free this weekend?" Frances Watson's voice was unusually bright. Margaret frowned slightly. "I don't have any special plans." "Why?" "Wonderful. We're having a barbecue in the backyard on Saturday. The whole family will be there. Can you come?" Margaret glanced at the calendar on her fridge. Saturday, her birthday. Her heart sank with a mix of surprise and wariness. Rarely had her parents acknowledged her birthday beyond a polite phone call or perhaps a small dinner. By contrast, her sister Rebecca's birthdays were yearly spectacles, lavish cakes, expensive gifts, and gatherings filled with admiration. Rebecca, the golden child. Margaret, the quiet shadow. "Should I bring anything?" Margaret asked cautiously. "No, just yourself," her mother said, sounding pleased. When the call ended, Margaret set the phone down slowly. Her chest was tight with conflicting emotions. Could this be different? Or was it just another gathering where Rebecca's presence would eclipse hers? She remembered her father's words years ago when she had proudly told him she'd been promoted to head nurse. "It's a shame you didn't aim to become a doctor." The sting of that remark had never fully faded. At the hospital, her dedication was unquestioned. Her colleagues admired her, and the children adored her. Eleanor Green, her closest friend and fellow nurse, often reminded her of her worth. Eleanor, with her sharp humor and unshakable loyalty, had been at Margaret's side since their rookie years. They shared everything from late-night snacks after shifts to movie marathons on weekends. Then there was James, Eleanor's brother, an architect with a thoughtful gaze and gentle manners. He had a quiet strength that drew Margaret in. At 45, unmarried, and deeply dedicated to his work, he seemed to understand her solitude in a way others could not. Their dinners together were never just casual meals. They were conversations that lingered in Margaret's mind long after she returned home. And there was Edna Miller, Margaret's neighbor, a widow in her 70s, who had become a second mother in every sense that mattered. They often shared simple dinners, strolled through the park, and leaned on each other in ways only two lonely hearts could. "Maggie, you are wonderful enough. Don't doubt your own worth," Edna would often say, her wrinkled hand resting warmly over Margaret's. Those words stayed with her longer than any compliment her real mother had ever offered. Margaret glanced at the clock. Time had slipped away. She grabbed her bag, tucked her phone inside, and hurried toward the door. Today was going to be a long day, 3 new patients arriving, a staff meeting in the afternoon, and most importantly, Sarah was coming over after school. As the elevator descended, Margaret leaned against the wall, her thoughts drifting back to Saturday. Could this barbecue truly be a gesture of change, of recognition? Or would it be another carefully disguised reminder that in her parents' eyes, Rebecca was everything, and she was simply there? The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open to the brisk Chicago morning. Margaret inhaled deeply, letting the cool air wake her fully. This time might be different, she whispered to herself, stepping into the flow of the city. "Facility. Actually, she's been asking to see you." The words echoed in Margaret's ears long after the social worker had hung up. She stood still for a moment, phone in hand, her heart tightening. Sarah wanted to see her. Sarah needed her. Without hesitation, Margaret grabbed her coat and headed for St. Mary's Children's Care Facility. That afternoon, the long hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and crayons. As soon as Margaret stepped inside, she saw a small figure waiting at the far end. Sarah's eyes lit up the moment she spotted her, and the 12-year-old sprinted forward, her shoes tapping against the linoleum. "Margaret, you came." Sarah threw herself into her arms, clutching her tightly as though afraid she might disappear. Tears brimmed in her eyes. "Of course, Sarah," Margaret whispered, holding her just as firmly. "I won't leave you alone." She fought to keep her own tears at bay, forcing her voice to remain steady for the child's sake. Margaret pulled back slightly and searched the girl's face. "What happened?" Sarah lowered her gaze, her small fingers twisting in Margaret's sleeve. "I was a bad girl," she murmured. "I got angry when David, the foster father, tried to throw away my drawings. They were the ones I made with the art supplies you gave me." A heavy silence fell between them. Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, sharp and hot. She could picture Sarah's little hands trying to protect her drawings, the very pieces that gave her comfort and joy. The thought of someone dismissing that made Margaret's stomach churn. As she left the facility later, Margaret's decision had already crystallized. She stopped Jennifer, the caseworker, near the exit. "I want to apply for adoption formally," Margaret said without hesitation. Jennifer blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Are you sure? As a single woman with such a demanding job, it will be difficult." "I'm sure." Margaret's voice was unwavering, her eyes firm. "I need Sarah, and Sarah needs me." For a moment, Jennifer studied her, then nodded slowly. "All right, we'll begin the application process, but you should know, the screening will be strict." The following weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments and preparation. Margaret rearranged her small apartment, transforming the spare room into a cheerful space filled with pastel curtains, soft bedding, and shelves waiting for Sarah's books and toys. She pored over her work schedule, speaking with hospital administrators to shift her hours. Her life was busy already, but the thought of Sarah living with her gave her an energy she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't alone in her efforts. Eleanor checked in daily, offering advice and a steady shoulder. James stopped by to help assemble furniture, teasing Margaret about her poor skills with a hammer. Edna, her elderly neighbor, came over in the evenings with home-cooked meals, insisting Margaret needed to eat properly while juggling so much. "Maggie, you're a strong woman," Edna told her one night over tea, her voice full of quiet pride. "Choosing your own path is never easy." Margaret's eyes softened. "Edna, I'm truly grateful to have you. You're more of a mother to me than my own family has ever been." Edna reached across the table, her wrinkled hand resting gently on Margaret's. "There are things more precious than blood ties. You and Sarah are already connected in your hearts." By late July, Margaret's world was shifting in another way. She had begun spending more time with James. Their friendship, long grounded in comfort and easy conversations, was changing, growing deeper. One warm evening, James invited her to the Chicago Art Museum. The cool, echoing halls were filled with vibrant paintings and sculptures, but Margaret's attention was as much on him as on the art. "About Sarah," James said, his gaze fixed on a watercolor painting. "I'd like to meet her too." Margaret turned, startled. "Really? That would be wonderful. Sarah would be delighted." James smiled faintly. "I like children, especially those curious about art. Architecture isn't so different, it's about creating beauty and meaning." Her chest warmed at his sincerity. The following weekend, they all went together, Margaret, James, Eleanor, and Edna, at St. Mary's. Sarah's initial shyness melted away within minutes. She listened to James with rapt attention as he sketched shapes for her, explaining how buildings came to life from lines on paper. "Margaret, is he your boyfriend?" Sarah asked innocently, her big eyes filled with curiosity. Margaret flushed, stammering, "Well, not exactly, not yet. But we might be," James teased gently, sending Margaret's heart into a flutter. By mid-August, the adoption screening was nearly complete. The home visit had gone smoothly, her finances and references had been approved, and her connection with Sarah was undeniable. Only the final interview remained. Lying in bed the night before, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. "If tomorrow goes well, Sarah will officially become my daughter." The word, daughter, was foreign on her tongue, yet it filled her chest with warmth. She imagined Sarah's laughter echoing through her apartment, imagined birthdays, school recitals, and quiet nights spent reading stories together. Her heart beat with both anxiety and hope. With those mixed emotions, she finally drifted into uneasy sleep. The phone jolted her awake at dawn. "Miss Watson," it was Dr. David Clark, the pediatrician from St. Mary's. His tone was grave. "I'm calling about Sarah." Margaret's chest tightened. "Sarah, did something happen?" "There's a possibility her leukemia has relapsed. She was brought in last night with a high fever and fatigue. We're running tests now." Her breath caught. The fragile hope she had been holding shattered in an instant. For a moment, her legs gave way, and she sank onto the bed. But only for a moment. She stood again, straightening her shoulders. Sarah needed her. This was no time for despair. When Margaret arrived at the hospital, Sarah lay sleeping in a small bed, her skin pale against the white sheets, an IV line running into her thin arm. The sight nearly broke her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Outside the room, Eleanor was waiting with worried eyes. "Maggie, I heard, are you all right?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I need to be strong for Sarah." By afternoon, James and Edna had joined them. The four of them sat together in the waiting area, silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Hours stretched endlessly until Drive. Clark returned, his face somber. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "The tests confirm a relapse, but we caught it earlier this time. There's still hope." Margaret leaned forward. "What treatment is needed?" "We'll restart chemotherapy immediately. Depending on her response, we may consider a bone marrow transplant. If there's a match among blood relatives, the success rate is much higher." "Test my bone marrow," Margaret said instantly. Her voice didn't waver. "Even if we're not blood related, is there a chance?" "Yes, it's possible, though less likely." James stepped forward. "Then test me too." "And me," Eleanor added firmly. "Me as well," Edna said in a trembling but determined voice. "I'll do whatever I can for that child." Margaret's throat tightened. These people, her chosen family, stood with her, ready to fight for Sarah when her own blood relatives hadn't even called. When Sarah stirred awake, the four of them surrounded her bed. The girl blinked weakly, then smiled faintly. "Everyone, you came." "Of course we came," Margaret said, gripping her hand. "We're your family." At that, Eleanor, James, and Edna each nodded. In that hospital room, though there were no blood ties, the truth was undeniable. Margaret's heart hardened with resolve. Saving Sarah, showing her what a real family was, that was her mission now.